This last session is much more open, if you like, than the other sessions in terms of we have a very, very broad agenda that's aimed basically around the idea of policy learning, both what can be learned and in a more practical sense maybe what kind of policy choices or levers are actually transferable from what we've learned. And there's a whole range of political science literature about policy transfer or policy learning, and a Danish political scientist, Nedergaard, has often observed that we learn not so much sometimes about the specific policy choices, but we learn just as much about the governance context in which we need to move forward, but also about the value systems and the cultural aspects in which different policy aspects are embedded. And I think that's already come through this morning to some extent. There was a lot of talk about the nature of the consensus, the nature of social partnership in the Nordic model. For myself, I've always been really impressed with the Nordic model from a governance perspective in terms of women's participation in senior decision making, both in political but also in broader spheres of economic and social life in the Nordic countries, and what contribution that makes to a better politics, better economics and society. So there's much that we have to learn now, and I hope we would continue that theme of the culture and the values influencing the type of policy opportunities that are there. I suppose Richard Rose, an eminent British political scientist, argues that policy transfer is most likely when three different variables overlap. One is a political opportunity, some space opening up in the political scheme in order to need change, and we certainly have that now. The second variable needs to be the actual visible transfer of learning, the learning process, and I suppose that's what is trying to be created here today. But the third thing that's necessary is the institutional fit or the cultural fit between where you're transferring from and where you're trying to transfer to. And I think we'll certainly be touching on that today, the appropriateness of some of the transferability of some of the lessons that we learned today. So we've a lot to get through, and very, very kindly we had 4 speakers on this panel, but already we've had some Nordic style cooperation because both Peadar and Baldur have agreed to co-join their contribution into one joint contribution, and that means we'll have 3 overall contributions, which will win us back the time that we've lost already and give the full hour for our discussion. So we'll keep the order that we had on the timetable, with Robin Wilson first, then Petty Murderan, and then Peadar and Baldur will do their joint one. So I'm going to do what other speakers have done in terms of just introduce the speakers and leave it to them to take the flow with the 15 minutes each. I am going to be fairly strict on the timing for those contributions so that we can get as much contributions from the floor as possible then. So just to quickly introduce in order that they're going to be with you, Dr. Robin Wilson is an independent researcher and is a long-term member of the TASC Council. He's actually just recently been commissioned to do a paper on the Nordic model for TASC, a flourishing society. And he's been very involved with Compass and their project, Building the Good Society, and he's published quite widely in that respect. Our guest then, Ambassador Pertti Umajan, has been the ambassador in Finland since 2009. But prior to that, he's had a long distinguished career in the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, including a lot of development cooperation experience in Africa, Asia and Latin America. And I think we're particularly interested here in terms of policy learning from his experience as ambassador and the permanent representative of Finland to both the OECD and to UNESCO over the period 2005 to 2009. And I know he's very keen to impart some of that knowledge here. Professor Peadar Kirby is a dear colleague of mine, co-author of the book, is the Professor of International Politics and Public Policy in the University of Limerick. And he's recently joined Baldur as Adjunct Professor of Political Science in the University of Iceland. He's obviously published widely, and I know his work will be familiar to a lot of people in the room, and he's just recently co-authored with Baldur the publication that was referred to earlier. And last but not least, Baldur Thorlarsson. He's the Jean Monnet Professor of Political Science and the founder of the Centre for Small State Studies at the University of Iceland. And he's published very widely on the issue of small states, European integration and Iceland's foreign policy. His 2 most recent books are Iceland and European Integration, On the Edge, and The Role of Small States in the European Union. So clearly some very valuable lessons to be had from such a distinguished body. So I'll just leave it over to them and invite Robin to take the floor.
I think we're all indebted to the support from the various Nordic governments with ambassadors represented here today. Those of you who are not Nordic will recognise this title. For those of you who are, however, I should explain, it goes back to what now seems like a completely bizarre debate in the 1980s in Ireland about contraception, previously illegal. And the law was changed by the then Taoiseach Charles Hoy to introduce contraception for what was described as bona fide family planning purposes for married couples. And it was described at the time as an Irish solution to an Irish problem. It didn't prove a very durable one. It turned out that in fact Ireland had to follow the rest of Europe in terms of attitudes to reproductive rights, though not yet on abortion, unfortunately. I think what I'm going to say may suggest that that's a parable for a wider discussion about the future of Ireland's social model. So what I'm going to talk about is a bit about so I'm quite short, so we need that height of a microphone. Talk a bit about because now I can't see my screen. The nature of the Irish crisis, a bit about who's on what Europe, because I don't think we can discuss anything these days in an Irish context without discussing the wider European crisis. A bit about elements of the Nordic model, which I'll whiz through because a lot of it we have discussed already, and the recent dilemmas. Then I'm going to suggest what Europe would look like remodeled in the Nordic style, and finally apply the model to the Irish context. Okay, let's start from here and come back to here at the end. I think it's worth starting by saying that this crisis in Ireland is not a conjunctural crisis. It's not a mere depression in the business cycle. This is a profoundly structural crisis, not just an economic crisis either, but it ranges over the whole of this society. But what strikes me is the lack of any clear alternative from the progressive arena to the crisis beyond modest and discrete political reforms such as those that have been discussed on the political reform website. There's a risk in that context of what Antonio Gramsci called a passive revolution, revolution restoration. That's to say a situation where there's a real apparent potential for change, but it's not realised as the conservative forces take control. If you want to see what a passive revolution looks like, you look at the responses from Labour ministers who were previous student leaders only in the last couple of days to demands for free higher education, which they seem to have forgotten. I think the problem is fundamentally, and this goes back to what David was saying earlier about the lack of a social democratic tradition in Ireland, since Labour must wait in 1918. Because of that, Ireland lacks the discursive elements of a progressive alternative, and in any event, it can't be a narrowly national one. And that, in the context of Irish nationalism, is itself part of the problem. And what fundamentally I want to say is the extent of the difficulty, the extent of the failure we have to address, is that we're still using the political discourse in Ireland of 18th century republicanism to try and solve the problems that only 21st century social democracy can solve. And that's a bit like trying to apply Newtonian mechanics to post-Einstein cosmos. We understand what Newtonian mechanics is like. It's like billiard balls hitting each other, it's like common sense. Einstein tells us about space-time and how it curves and how things aren't quite what they seem. And that's what science does. Science tells you things you don't expect. Science tells you strange things. Common sense tells you nothing. And my concern is that, as we will see, we have an awful lot to learn in an Irish context from the Nordic model, things that just would seem, and do seem, bizarre and impossible to comprehend on the basis of traditional Irish political discourse. And there are three paradoxes I'm going to come to in a moment to explain all that. In the meantime, a bit about Europe. For many years, Europe was conceived, as people in European integration studies would have put it, as sui generis, something of its own, not quite intergovernmental, not quite federal, but it's taken a quite sharp intergovernmental turn, or like these a monogovernmental turn, with Germany very much in the driving seat. The German state remains obsessed by the fear of Weimar inflation, and is, as a result, imposing a pre-Keynesian deflation across Europe, not just Ireland, of course, but elsewhere, which is now threatening a rapid Eurozone collapse within weeks, quite possibly. If people like Muriel Rubini or Wolfgang Wincott are to be believed, and I would certainly believe Muriel Rubini and Wolfgang Wincott, or I would believe Nicolas Sarkozy or Angela Merkel. There's a need to fight in that context for a federal Europe in a different mould. Fiscally responsible, yes, but geared to rebuilding social solidarity. And the model for that, it seems to me, is provided by the Nordic Social Democratic heartlands. And we want to build a new Europe. It has to be Europe in the style of the Nordic experience rather than the style of contemporary conservative Germany. Now, these paradoxes which defy all Irish political common sense about the Nordic model. The first one is about the welfare state. No one in the Irish political class understands how universal welfare states operate, and therefore they can't understand why it should be that they are more fiscally sustainable than their means-tested Anglo-American alternatives. I think it was Stein showed earlier the histogram with showing that the countries that were in the black, that had assets, the Nordic countries, everybody else was in the red. And that's because, as Tom was explaining in his discussion about revenue and expenditure, there's a virtuous circle of high and progressive taxation, which, as Torben was saying, binds in the professional middle class. There's quite a lot of discussion about the trust issue this morning, where it comes from, and we know from European Social Study question, do you think most people can trust or do you have to look after yourself, that there is much higher trust in Nordic countries. That comes fundamentally from the universal welfare state, as Paul Rothstein argues, because everybody pays, everybody benefits, and it's done on a transparent basis. And it's also the case that that trust is based on very good governance arrangements, impartial public authority, as Bo argues. And if you look at the latest, the recent report by Bertelsmann on governance indicators across Europe, again, the Nordic countries come out on top. There's a large redistributive effect on post-market incomes with the taxation system, though I accept the point earlier about the importance of employment per se. Gender equality, we haven't talked about enough today, in the Nordic model is crucial, fostered by universal childcare and access to employment, albeit somewhat gender segregated in the welfare state. And high employment rates has already been discussed, with in fact quite high replacement ratios, very high benefit levels, but people being encouraged to enter labour markets, market schemes, as we were told, to stay in the labour market and in employment. A bit about the schools, we've all talked about many times about Finland. The Finnish school is no mystery. It's like any social institution that works. It works because several things work together. It works because the kids don't go to school till they're 7. It works because the classes are small. It works because lunch is free. It works because teachers move with their classes so they can develop pastoral relationships with them. It works because teachers have master's qualifications. And it works because they're given considerable autonomy in how they teach. There are almost no competing private schools, and there are no inspections. That's why it works. There are no national examinations until students leave at 18. And while there is a separation between academic and vocational strands at 16, each can lead to a university place, and that too is free. That's why the Finnish school works. Okay, second paradox. Civil society is much stronger in the Nordic countries than elsewhere in Europe, despite the widespread assumption that a strong state must imply a weak civil society, as in David Cameron's notion of the big society. I think everybody was incredibly moved by the mobilisation in Norway after the Utøya massacre, and the way that the Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg responded to that. It was hugely inspiring. And undoubtedly hugely supportive to the victims. Average Swede is a member of 3 organisations. That's how strong civic society is in Sweden. The main organisations aren't welfare providers as in Ireland, but they're social movements, and to a lesser extent social enterprises. And again, particularly in Sweden, volunteering is mainly understood as activism in an organisation of which one is a member rather than being charity work. And there's a strong engagement with the political arena. For example, in Sweden, there's a forum called the Swedish Forum for Popular Mass Movements. There's a whole history of things called governmental commissions, of which there are several hundred at any one time, which engage civil society in discussion about legislation that's coming up. So again, this builds trust in the institutions of government. Third paradox, the Nordic economy should be basket cases by orthodox neoliberal standards, since they have these high tax revenues and strong regulation. Yet, as we also heard already, they bunch near the top of the business competitiveness leagues. The argument I think you can make in that context is that what's behind this is that the security of partially decommodified labour, we talked about that this morning vis-à-vis the welfare state, the security brings greater work commitment and productivity, and of course high investment by the state in infrastructure, R&D, training, and so on, benefits all enterprises, and so the record of attraction of foreign investment is actually very strong in Sweden, as well as having these indigenous transnationals themselves. Okay, just some of the recent problems to add to the challenges that were mentioned earlier by Torben. There is a difficulty of a growing residue of the socially marginalised, and the social assistance they receive as outsiders to the system has been cut in recent years in both Finland and Sweden. Gender equality has unwittingly been associated, as Esping Andersen argues, with growing inequality between women by class. And voluntary activism is a bit more like the Greenpeace model of signing a cheque and sending it off rather than taking part in activism. And of course in Sweden, Social Democrats have been in power for much of the 20th century, been out of government for 2 terms. What would a remodel of Europe, more like the Nordic style, look like? The current trajectory in Europe is defined what Keynes called the paradox of thrift. Sauve qui peut means, in that context, everyone drowns. And Europe needs what in Norway has been called collective solutions, in a Norwegian context, that is. The principle applies grosso modo. Desocialised with the ECB becoming a lender of last resort. We need a 2-club rather than 1-club macroeconomic policy, and Europe needs to be fiscally as well as monetarily integrated, and we must have a move towards democratic federalism. But in an Irish context, what are we talking about in terms of the ideas one learns from the Nordic model? First of all, forget about targeting welfare. Again, it's so often said in Ireland, if we're less money to spend, let's target it better on the most needy. That's completely wrong-headed. All you do is stigmatise the poor and increase the tax aversion of the rich. What you really need to do is always to move in a more universal direction, for example, by ending the two-tier health system. We need to reconceive education as a public good, like in the Finnish context, not as a system embodied by a points system of an individual commodity competitively acquired against others. We need to invest fundamentally in high quality, accessible childcare. That's absolutely central to the Nordic model, again, maybe underestimated so far, but that is absolutely at the heart of it is high quality, universal childcare. We need to make the case for progressive taxation in Ireland, hard though it is, but we can point to the social comfort and the fiscal sustainability it brings, and we need to talk about the benefits of it as well as the burdens, and we need finally to stop engaging in a beggar thy neighbour short-sightedness and corporation tax, which has just squandered all the goodwill Ireland used to have, particularly in Germany, when it needs it most. And lastly, we need to democratise democracy. As I said, governance in Nordic countries is very well benchmarked, as the Bertelsmann indicators showed, and fundamentally in Ireland we need to replace a system of clientelism that is top-down and opaque by a system of good, transparent governance that is impartial and that stimulates the kind of active civic society that we've seen the Nordic countries to have. Thank you very much. Sorry, that was a rush.